The one who couldn't keep him. That's what Danielle called me, in front of 30 people, in front of my own granddaughter's unicorn-shaped birthday cake. Before I had even taken my coat off, I was standing in the doorway of my son's backyard, balloons swaying behind me, a wrapped gift still in my hands, when I heard her voice carry over the chatterbright, casual, the way you'd mention the weather. Everyone, this is Regina, she said, looping her arm through a stranger's elbow to steer the introduction, Terence's first wife, the one who couldn't keep him. A small laugh followed, the kind people give when they are not sure if something was a joke or not, and then the conversation simply moved on, because to everyone else in that yard, it had barely registered as anything at all. I did not drop the gift. I did not raise my voice. I smiled the smile I had perfected over 54 years of being underestimated, and I said, "Nice to meet you too," to the stranger whose name I never caught, and I walked further into the yard as if nothing had happened, but something had happened, something precise, something aimed, delivered with the casual cruelty of a woman who had learned, correctly, that I would not make a scene at my own granddaughter's 5th birthday party. I found a chair near the fence, away from the bounce house, away from the table where Terence was refilling lemonade like a man who had never once, in 26 years of marriage, refilled anything without being asked twice. I sat, and I watched my granddaughter Zia chase bubbles across the grass in a yellow dress, and I let the sentence sit in my chest the way you let a hot coal sit in your palm for exactly as long as it takes to decide whether you're going to flinch. I did not flinch. Not the My daughter-in-law Brianna caught my eye from across the yard, and I watched her face do the thing it always did when Danielle spoke, a flicker of discomfort, quickly folded away, replaced by the practiced neutrality of a woman who had decided, a long time ago, that keeping the peace between her husband's mother and her husband's father's new wife was not a battle worth fighting. I understood it. I did not resent her for it. But I noted it, the way I noted everything now, quietly, precisely, filed away. Before I tell you what happened at that party, and everything that came after it, let me ask you something. Have you ever been reduced to a punchline at your own family's table, not by a stranger, but by someone who married into the very family you built? Tell me where you're watching from tonight, because I have a feeling some of you already know exactly what I'm about to describe. Terence approached the chair beside me with 2 paper cups of lemonade, handed me one without asking if I wanted it, and sat down like the years between us had never happened, like his new wife's voice hadn't just carved a small, deliberate wound into the afternoon. She didn't mean anything by it, he said, not looking at me, looking instead at Zia chasing bubbles. I know exactly what she meant by it, I said, and I sipped the lemonade, because it was hot outside, and I was not going to give him the satisfaction of watching me set the cup down untouched. Regina. He said my name the way he used to say it when we were married, and he wanted me to let something go before it became a thing. 26 years of marriage teaches you a man's entire vocabulary of avoidance. And Terence Calloway had a rich one. I'm not making a scene, Terence, I said. I'm sitting in a chair, drinking lemonade, watching our granddaughter blow bubbles. If you're waiting for a scene, you're going to be disappointed. He exhaled, the particular exhale of a man relieved that a woman he once loved has, once again, chosen not to be difficult. I used to think that exhale meant I had won something. I have come to understand, in the 2 years since our divorce was finalized, that it meant something closer to the opposite, that my silence had simply made his life easier, the way it had for 2.5 decades. Danielle appeared then, sliding into the empty chair on Terence's other side, her sunglasses pushed up into hair that had clearly been styled that morning by someone who charged more than I made in a week doing it. She was 34. I knew this because Terence had mentioned it once, early on, in the tone of a man bragging about a car he shouldn't have bought, not maliciously, just carelessly, the way men sometimes forget that the woman across from them once counted her own 34th birthday among the years she spent building the very life he was now dismantling, one Sunday dinner at a time. Regina, that color looks so good on you, Danielle said, gesturing at my blouse with the same bright, easy tone she'd used to introduce me as a punchline 20 minutes earlier. Did you get it from that little boutique on Camden? I keep meaning to go in. I looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable, long enough that she shifted slightly in her chair, long enough that Terence's jaw tightened in the way I recognized from decades of watching him brace for a confrontation that, once again, was not going to arrive. It's from my store, I said simply. Danielle blinked. You have a store? I have a design studio, I said. Callaway and Rowe, on Camden. We do residential and commercial interiors. It's been open 3 years. I watched something pass across her face, not quite embarrassment, something closer to recalibration, the visible mental effort of a woman realizing that the first wife she had just described to a stranger as someone who couldn't keep a man was, in fact, a woman who had built something with her own 2 hands in the 2 years since that man had left. It was a small moment. It would have been easy to miss if you weren't watching for it, and I have gotten very good, lately, at watching for it. That's wow. That's great, Regina, she said, and there was something almost sincere buried under the surprise, which somehow stung more than the introduction. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters. And because I've noticed that stories like mine are often told as though the other woman is a monster and the ex-husband is a fool and the whole world exists to make one woman suffer for the crime of aging out of a marriage. That is not entirely what this is. Danielle was not cruel in the way you're imagining. She simply did not think of me as a fool person, not out of malice, but out of the quiet, careless arrogance of someone who has never once had to imagine herself in my chair. To her, I was a chapter that had ended so that her chapter could begin. It did not occur to her that I might still be writing. Before we go further, let me know, have you ever watched someone recalibrate their opinion of you in real time, the moment they realized you had built something they didn't expect? There's a particular kind of satisfaction in that moment, and I want to know if you've felt it too. The party moved forward the way parties do. Cake was cut. Z, sticky-fingered and radiant, insisted that I be the one to help her blow out the candles, and for 4 minutes, standing behind my granddaughter with my hands resting lightly on her small shoulders, I forgot entirely that anyone in that yard had ever called me anything at all. It was only later, as the party thinned and the adults gathered near the patio with wine and the particular loose-tongued honesty that comes after 2 hours of daytime drinking, that I heard the second thing, the thing that would matter far more than the introduction, though I didn't understand that yet. I had gone inside to help Brianna wrap the leftover cake, standing at her kitchen island with foil and a cake knife, when I heard Danielle's voice drift in from the patio, pitched low but not low enough, talking to a woman I didn't recognize. Terence's ex is sweet, honestly, I feel bad for her, Danielle was saying. But it's not like she has anywhere else to be, you know. No kids of her own with anyone new. No, I mean, thank God Trey's letting her stay involved with Z, because otherwise what would she even? The rest of the sentence was lost under Brianna clattering a pan into the sink, too loudly, too quickly, in a way that told me she had heard it too and was trying clumsily to drown it out for my sake. I did not finish wrapping the cake with trembling hands. I want you to understand that my hands were perfectly steady. I folded the foil into a clean, precise seam, the way I fold every seam, the way I have learned to fold every difficult thing in my life, carefully, completely, without letting anyone see the effort it costs. But I heard it. Thank God Trey's letting her stay involved with Z, letting me. As though my own granddaughter were a privilege extended to me by my son's generosity, rather than a bond that existed before Danielle had ever set foot in this family, before she had ever learned my name, let alone decided what I couldn't keep. Brianna turned from the sink, her face flushed, and said, "Too fast, Regina. I am so sorry." She wasn't thinking. She talks before she, Brianna, I said, and I kept my voice gentle, because none of this was Brianna's fault, and because I had long ago decided that the people who apologize for others' cruelty are rarely the ones who deserve to carry it. It's all right, truly. It was not all right, but I have found that the truest things I've ever said have often been the ones that weren't, said in exactly the tone that made everyone around me believe otherwise. I finished wrapping the cake. I carried it to the refrigerator myself, taking a moment longer than necessary, with the door open, letting the cold air settle whatever had risen in my chest back down to somewhere I could manage it. Because here is what nobody in that backyard knew, not Terence, not Danielle, not even Brianna, who has always been kinder to me than family required her to be. 3 weeks earlier, my attorney had called with news about a discrepancy in the divorce settlement records, a small irregularity in how the retirement accounts had been divided, something Terence's own lawyer had flagged. Buried in paperwork, nobody had thought I would ever go back and read closely enough to notice. I had noticed. I had said nothing to anyone, not to my son, not to my sister, not to the two friends who still called me every Sunday to check that I was eating. I had simply taken the documents home, spread them across my kitchen table under the good lamp, and begun, quietly, to read, letting me stay involved with my own granddaughter. I closed the refrigerator door, smoothed the front of my blouse, the one from my own store, the one Danielle had complimented without knowing whose hands had built the business behind it, and I walked back out into the yard, smiling, to say goodbye to a granddaughter who did not yet know that her grandmother was 3 weeks into quietly discovering exactly how much she had been permitted to lose, and precisely how much of it she intended to take back. I did not go home after the party. I drove instead to the small brick building on Camden Avenue that houses Callaway and Rowe, let myself in through the side door, and sat in the dark showroom among fabric swatches and unfinished mood boards until my hands stopped feeling like they belonged to someone standing at the edge of a decision. This is the part where I should probably tell you who I was before any of this, before the yard, before Danielle, before a stranger's careless sentence became the loudest thing in my week. My name is Regina Callaway. I am 54 years old. I was married to Terence for 26 years, and for 24 of those years, I believed, the way you believe the sun will rise, that we were building something permanent. I raised our son Trey in a brick colonial in the Prince George's County suburb where I still live, alone now, in a house too big for one person and exactly the right size for the woman I am becoming. I hosted Sunday dinners for 15 years running. I sat on the deacon board at Mount Calvary for a decade. I built Terence's professional wardrobe, managed his calendar before he could afford an assistant, sat up nights helping him rehearse presentations for promotions that eventually made him comfortable enough to stop noticing who had helped him get there. And then, 4 years ago, at 50, Terence came home from a conference in Charlotte and told me, over a pot roast I had spent all afternoon preparing, that he no longer felt like himself in our marriage. He used the word stagnant. He used the word unfulfilled. He did not, that night, use the word Danielle, though I would learn her name within the month, along with the fact that she had been his junior colleague for exactly the 11 months, during which he had described our marriage to me as merely going through something. I want to tell you that I screamed. I want to tell you I threw the pot roast against the kitchen wall, because there are nights, even now, when some younger version of myself wishes I had, but that has never been who I am. I set down my fork. I asked him to repeat himself, because I wanted to be certain I had understood him correctly. And when he did, I nodded, finished clearing the table, and did not cry until he had gone upstairs to sleep in the guest room he would occupy for the next 11 months while we untangled a life. That is who I was walking into the divorce. A woman who did not raise her voice even when her entire world was rearranging itself around her. Before I go further, I want to ask you something, because I think it says a great deal about how we are raised as women, particularly the ones of us who came up being told that grace under pressure was the highest form of strength. Have you ever absorbed devastating news so quietly that the person delivering it walked away believing it hadn't devastated you at all? I have a feeling many of you know exactly what that silence costs, and exactly how long it takes to pay it back to yourself. The divorce itself took 11 months to finalize. I did not fight for the house out of spite. I fought for it because I had built every room of it with my own choices. And I was not prepared to hand my life's craftsmanship to a woman who would, I suspected even then, replace my curtains within the year. I got the house. Terence got the lake cabin his father had left him, along with, I believed, an equitable division of our 2 retirement accounts. Mine built from 18 years running my own small design consultancy on the side of raising our son. His built from a corporate career that I had quietly scaffolded for over 2 decades. I trusted the settlement. I trusted my attorney at the time, a kind but overworked woman named Patricia, who handled 40 cases at once, and, I would later understand, had not read the fine print of the qualified domestic relations order with the attention it required. I signed what I was told to sign. I moved forward. I told myself, the way women my age are taught to tell ourselves, that dignity meant not looking back, not auditing, not turning grief into forensic accounting. I was wrong about that. I understand now that dignity and vigilance are not opposites. It took me 2 years, and a careless sentence at my granddaughter's birthday party, to understand it. 3 weeks before his party, I had switched to turn is not because I suspected anything, but because Patricia had retired and handed her remaining clients to a sharp, quiet young woman named Dominique Ferris, who called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was pricing upholstery fabric and said, in the careful, measured tone lawyers use when they are about to ruin your week, "Mrs. Calloway, I need you to come into the office. I found something in your file I think you should see." What Dominique had found was this: the qualified domestic relations order dividing Terence's 401k, the one meant to transfer to me the portion accumulated during our marriage, had never actually been executed, not properly. A clerical failure, Dominique believed, though she was careful to say believed rather than certain, the kind of gap between two attorneys' offices that happens more often than anyone likes to admit, where a document gets drafted, approved in principle, and somehow never actually filed with the plan administrator, which meant that for 2 years, the retirement account that was legally, on paper, half my nearly $340,000 of it had continued sitting entirely in Terence's name, growing, accessible to him, untouched by the order that was supposed to divide it. I did not tell Terence. I did not tell Trey. I told no one, because Dominique had cautioned me, correctly, that the first thing to establish was whether this had been an honest oversight or something else. And because some quiet, unhurried part of me wanted to watch, for a little while, before I acted, sitting in my dark showroom the night of the birthday party, I opened my laptop and reread the email Dominique had sent me that morning, before the party, before Danielle's sentence, before letting me stay involved with my own granddaughter, had rearranged something permanently in my chest. The email contained one new piece of information I had not yet had the heart to fully absorb. 3 withdrawals had been made from that account in the past 14 months, totaling just under $60,000, none of them reported to me, none of them legally his to take a loan. I sat with the number for a long time. $60,000 is not an accident. $60,000 is a decision, made 3 separate times, by a man who knew who had to know that the account was never supposed to be entirely his to draw from. I thought about the ring on Danielle's finger, upgraded twice since their wedding 18 months ago, according to my sister-in-law, who still calls me every few weeks with more information than I ask for. I thought about the renovated kitchen at Terence's new house that Trey had mentioned in passing, the one with the waterfall island Danielle had posted about online. I thought about the sunglasses pushed up into professionally styled hair, and I did the quiet math that women in my position learn to do, whether we want to or not. Let me know, before I go on, have you ever discovered that the getting over it you'd worked so hard to project to your family was, in fact, giving someone room to quietly take more than their share, simply because they trusted you'd never look closely enough to notice? I think that particular kind of trust, the trust that a hurt woman won't fight back, is one of the most common, and most dangerous, assumptions men make about women like us. I closed the laptop. I did not call Dominique that night, though I would first thing the following morning. Instead, I sat in the quiet of my own store, surrounded by the tangible proof of what I had built with my own 2 hands in the 2 years since Terence had told me, over pot roast, that he no longer felt like himself, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that the woman who had sat silently through a public humiliation that afternoon and the woman who was about to spend the next several months carefully, methodically reclaiming what was legally hers were not in conflict with each other. They were the same woman. She had simply been deciding, this whole time, when it would be worth the energy to stop being gracious about things that were never hers to be gracious about. My phone buzzed against the counter. A text from Trey: "Thanks for coming today, Mom. Zoo wouldn't stop talking about the bubbles. Also, can we talk sometime this week? Something's been bothering me and I don't really know who else to ask." I stared at the message for a long moment. Trey rarely texted anything that wasn't logistics pickup times. A photo of Z. A quick thank you. This was different, careful. The kind of message a person sends when they've been sitting on something and haven't yet found the nerve to say it plainly. I typed back, "Of course, sweetheart, whenever you're ready." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. Appeared again, finally, not over text. "Can I come by the store tomorrow before you open?" Just as. I set the phone down on the counter, next to the laptop still holding Dominique's email, next to 2 years of fabric swatches I had chosen entirely on my own, without asking permission from anyone, and I felt something shift in the room that had nothing to do with the temperature. My son had never once, in 31 years, asked to speak to me alone, privately, about something that couldn't wait for a phone call. I did not know, sitting there in the dark, that what Trey wanted to tell me the next morning would have nothing to do with the retirement account, nothing to do with Danielle's careless sentence at the party, and everything to do with a conversation he had overheard 3 days earlier, one that involved his father, a real estate attorney, and the words "before Mom finds out." Trey arrived at the store the next morning before I had even unlocked the front door, sitting on the little iron bench outside with 2 coffers in his hands, the way he used to wait for me outside his elementary school when I'd run 5 minutes late picking him up. He was 31 years old, and for a moment, watching him through the glass, I saw him at 7. "You didn't have to bring coffee," I said, unlocking the door. "I didn't know what else to do with my hands," he said, and that told me more than anything he'd typed the night before. I led him back to the small office behind the showroom, cleared a stack of fabric samples off the second chair, and sat across from my son the way I used to sit across from him at the kitchen table when he was in middle school and needed to confess something before his father got home. Some rhythms, apparently, never entirely leave a family. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me, because I've been sick about this for 3 days." He turned the coffee cup in his hands without drinking from it. "Did you know Dad's trying to sell the lake cabin?" I kept my face still. "No, he hasn't mentioned it to me. Why would he need to? He wouldn't. That's not really the issue." Trey exhaled, and I watched him steady himself the way he used to before difficult conversations as a teenager, shoulders back, chin slightly lifted, a mannerism I recognized because it was the same one I did without realizing it. I was at his place last week picking up Sue's booster seat, and he was on the phone in his study with the door half open. I wasn't trying to listen. I heard my name. I stopped. "Trey." He was talking to somebody, a lawyer, I think, based on what he was saying about listing the cabin, and about moving up the timeline on something before. And I'm quoting him exactly, "Mom, before Regina's attorney starts asking questions about anything else." The office was very quiet. Somewhere in the showroom, the ceiling fan clicked on its slow rotation, and I was aware, distantly, of my own pulse. "Did he say anything else?" I asked, my voice even. "He said Trey stopped, looked down at the coffee cup, and I could see him deciding, in real time, whether loyalty to his father or honesty with his mother would win. I did not push him. I have never once, in 31 years, pushed my son toward an answer he needed to arrive at himself. He said Danielle wanted the money moved before the wedding anniversary trip, so it would be, quote, settled and boring by the time anyone thinks to look. And then he said something about the account. I didn't understand it fully. Mom. I don't know anything about qualified whatever orders, or 401ks. I just know it didn't sound right. And I know you. And I know when you smile at things that actually hurt you. And I saw that smile yesterday when Danielle said that thing about you in front of everyone. And I've been sitting on this for 3 days, because I didn't know if I was betraying my father by telling you or betraying you by not telling you." I reached across the small table and took my son's hand, the way I had taken it at his kindergarten graduation, at his college move-in, at the hospital the night Zia was born. "You are not betraying anyone, sweetheart, you told the truth, that is never a betrayal." "So it's real," Trey said quietly. "Whatever it is. It's real." I considered, for a long moment, how much to tell him. I have spent my entire adult life protecting my son from the parts of adulthood that felt too heavy for him to carry, first as a boy, then as a young man, and even now, at 31, some instinct in me still wanted to shoulder this alone and hand him only the finished, resolved version of the story once it no longer had teeth. But I looked at his face, the careful bracing in it, the same bracing I had done at his age, and I understood that protecting him from the truth now would only teach him the same lesson I had spent 26 years learning the hard way, that the people who love you sometimes think silence is a gift, when really it's just a heavier kind of burden, handed quietly to someone who never agreed to carry it. "There was an error," I said carefully, "in how your father's retirement account was divided during the divorce, legally, a portion of it should have transferred to me.It didn't. And in the time since, some money has been taken out of that account that I believe I'm entitled to. Trey's jaw tightened, and for one instant I saw something in his face that startled me, not the placid, easygoing expression I had grown used to since the divorce, the expression of a son determined not to take sides, but something sharper, older. How much money, Mom? That's not something you need to carry, Trey. How much? I told him. I watched him do the same silent arithmetic I had done the night before, watched the number land somewhere behind his eyes, watched him set the coffee cup down on the desk with more force than he intended. He's been taking money that's legally yours to pay for Danielle's wedding anniversary trip, Trey said, flat, disbelieving, the sentence sounding stranger each time either of us said a version of it aloud. I don't know that for certain yet, I said. I know what my attorney has found, and I know what you overheard. Those two things together paint a picture. But I intend to let the picture finish painting itself before I act on it. How can you be this calm about this? It was a fair question, and one I did not entirely have an honest answer to, even for myself. I have asked myself the same thing more times than I can count over the past 2 years in the parking lot after signing the divorce papers, in the quiet of my kitchen the first Thanksgiving I hosted alone, in the backyard yesterday with a stranger's careless sentence still ringing in my ears. How can you be this calm? Because calm is the only thing I've ever been allowed to be, and it turns out to be a far more useful weapon than anyone expects, I said, and I meant it more plainly than I had ever said it to another living soul, even my own son. Your father built a life believing I would never look closely enough to notice what he took. Everyone in that backyard yesterday believed the same thing about me when they decided it was safe to make me a punchline. I would rather let people keep believing that a little while longer, Trey, while I quietly find out exactly how deep this goes, than announce it to the world before I have every piece of proof I need to make sure it can never happen to me, or to anyone else in this family, again. Trey was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the desk. There's one more thing, he said finally, and something in his voice made the ceiling fan's soft click suddenly feel very loud. The lawyer on the phone, I heard Dad say a name, not Danielle's, somebody else. He said, make sure Marguerite doesn't find out about the second property until after the closing. I sat very still. Mom? Do you know who Marguerite is? I did not answer him right away, because I was doing something I had not done in longer than I could remember, running back through 26 years of marriage, searching for a name I had never once heard Terence say, in any context, at any point, in any year of the life we had built together. No, I said slowly. I have never heard that name in my life. And for the first time since Danielle's careless sentence had landed in my chest the day before, I felt something other than hurt settle into its place, something quieter, colder, and far more useful, curiosity. Dominique Ferris's office occupied the third floor of a converted row house near the county courthouse, and I was sitting across from her desk within 18 hours of hearing my son say a name I had never once encountered in 26 years of marriage. Marguerite, Dominique repeated, writing the name on a legal pad in handwriting so neat it looked typed. And you're certain you've never heard it before? Not a colleague, not a family friend, nothing. I've turned it over all night, I said. There's no one by that name in Terence's professional circle that I ever knew of. No one in his family. I would remember a name like that. Second property, Dominique said, tapping her pen against the pad. That's the part one want to run down first, because if there's a property your ex-husband acquired that wasn't disclosed during the divorce discovery process, that's a far bigger problem for him than a missed QDRO filing. Missed paperwork can be an honest mistake, Mrs. Calloway. Undisclosed assets during divorce proceedings is something a judge takes very differently. I want to pause here, because I think it matters to explain something about how these things actually unfold, not in the dramatic, single-scene way television teaches us to expect, but slowly, through phone calls and record requests, and the particular tedium of financial forensics. There was no single dramatic reveal in the days that followed. There was Dominique filing a request with the county recorder's office for any property transactions bearing Terence's name or social security number in The past 6 years, there was a wait of 9 business days that felt, to me, considerably longer. There was Trey, checking in every evening with a text that said only anything yet, to which I answered honestly, every night, not yet, sweetheart. I kept working. This is something I want to say plainly, because I think women in my position are sometimes expected to let their entire lives narrow down to the injustice being done to them, as though grief and vigilance leave no room for anything else. They do not narrow your life, they simply run alongside it. I met with 3 new clients that week: a young couple renovating a row house in Petworth, an older gentleman redoing his late wife's sunroom into something that no longer ached to walk into, a corporate office needing a full reception redesign. I chose fabric. I sourced reclaimed wood flooring. I built, brick by brick, the version of my life that had absolutely nothing to do with Terence Calloway, because I had learned, in the 2 years since our divorce, that this was the only kind of revenge that ever actually satisfied me, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet, permanent kind, built with my own hands, that no one could later claim credit for or take away. Before I tell you what the county records turned up, let me ask you something, because I think it's at the heart of why so many women stay quiet in situations like mine for far longer than we should. Have you ever discovered that being the reasonable one in a divorce or a family conflict meant everyone else felt safe, underestimating exactly how carefully you were still paying attention? I have a feeling a great many of you know that feeling far too well. On the 9th day, Dominique called me at the store, her voice carrying a particular clipped energy I hadn't heard from her before. "Mrs. Calloway, I need you to sit down." I'm sitting. "There's a property. A townhouse in Alexandria, purchased 18 months ago, title held under an LLC Whitfield Holdings Group with your ex-husband listed as the sole managing member, purchase price $420,000, and the down payment, Mrs. Calloway, came from a wire transfer originating from the very retirement account we've been investigating. 2 weeks before the QDRO should have been executed." I sat very still in my office chair, surrounded by fabric swatches, and did not say anything for a long moment. "There's more," Dominique continued. "I ran the LLC's registered agent filings. There's a second name attached, a Marguerite Beaumont, listed as co-manager. I did a basic search. She's a real estate agent, Mrs. Calloway. 38 years old, based in Alexandria. And based on the property records, she doesn't appear to be living in the townhouse. It's currently listed on a short-term rental platform." "He bought an investment property," I said slowly, "with money that was legally half mine, before the divorce was even finalized, and structured it through an LLC with another woman's name on it." "That's what the paper trail suggests, yes." I thought about the timeline. 18 months ago, Terence and Danielle had married 14 months ago, which meant this property, this LLC, this arrangement with a woman named Marguerite Beaumont, predated his marriage to Danielle by 4 months. "Dominique," I said carefully, "who exactly is Marguerite Beaumont to my ex-husband?" "I don't know yet," Dominique admitted. "The filings don't specify a relationship. It could be a legitimate business partner. Real estate investors do sometimes structure deals this way with agents who help them source properties. I don't want you drawing conclusions before we have more information. But I will say this: the timing of the withdrawal, 4 months before his wedding to Danielle, using funds that weren't fully his to use, is going to be very difficult for his attorney to explain away as an innocent overlap." After I hung up the phone, I sat in my office for a long while, turning the name Marguerite Beaumont over in my mind the way you turn over a stone to see what's living underneath it. I did not feel the wounded, reeling shock I might have expected from myself 2 years earlier. In the raw months right after the divorce, I felt something closer to the sensation of finally understanding a puzzle whose pieces had never quite fit the picture. Terence had always presented the sudden windfall that let him and Danielle renovate that kitchen with the waterfall island, the upgraded ring, the ease with which a man who had spent 26 years insisting we needed to be careful with money had, apparently, found nearly $400,000 to invest in real estate within 2 years of our divorce. I called Trey that evening and told him, gently, what Dominique had found: the townhouse, the LLC, the name Marguerite Beaumont, careful to frame it exactly as Dominique had framed it to me, as a set of facts that painted a troubling picture, but did not yet answer every question. Mom, Trey said, after a long silence, I think you need to know something, and I don't know if it's related, but I don't think it's a coincidence anymore. His voice had the particular tightness of a man about to hand over information he'd rather not be holding. Danielle mentioned something at the party yesterday, before all the stuff with you happened. She was talking to Brianna in the kitchen, and I overheard part of it. She said something about Terrence being distracted lately, checking his phone constantly, and she laughed about it, said she'd seen a text pop up on his lock screen from someone saved in his phone as M. Alexandria listing, and she joked that he'd better not be house hunting behind her back for a surprise anniversary trip. I closed my eyes. Mom, Trey said quietly, I don't think Marguerite Beaumont is just a business partner, and I don't think Danielle has any idea what she's actually married into. I sat with that for a long moment, in the quiet of my empty showroom, surrounded by the fabric and the wood samples and the small, permanent proof of a life I had built entirely on my own, and I understood, with the particular clarity that only arrives once every piece of a puzzle finally clicks into a shape you didn't want to see, that the story I thought I was uncovering was not the one I was actually standing in the middle of. I did not go to Terrence directly. I want to be honest about why. Because I think it says something important about the particular kind of patience women my age are taught to mistake for weakness, when really it is the sharpest tool we have. If I had confronted Terrence that week, armed only with a name overheard through a half-open door, and a property record still short on context, he would have done what he had always done best in 26 years of marriage: manage the narrative before I could finish gathering the facts. He would have called Trey a liar, or mistaken, or exaggerating. He would have framed Marguerite Beaumont as nothing more than a real estate professional who happened to help him find an investment property. And by the time I had assembled real proof, he would have had weeks to construct an explanation smooth enough to survive it. I had spent 26 years watching Terrence manage rooms, manage colleagues, manage me. I was not going to hand him a warning shot. So instead, I did something that surprised even me. I called Danielle. Dominique advised strongly against it. Mrs. Calloway, I understand the impulse, but legally and strategically, I'd caution you to let the discovery process run its course before you involve. Dominique, I said, I appreciate everything you're doing, but there's a woman out there who believes she is happily married, who has no idea that her husband may have used marital assets, mine, specifically to fund a property arrangement with another woman 4 months before their own wedding. I am not calling her to cause harm. I am calling her because somebody once should have extended me the same courtesy, and nobody did. I want to pause here and say something plainly, because I think it's the heart of everything that follows, and I don't want it lost in the mechanics of the story. This was not, for me, an act of revenge against Danielle. I understood, sitting with the phone in my hand that evening, that Danielle had wounded me carelessly at that birthday party. The punchline, the letting me stay involved with my own granddaughter. But I also understood that a woman who says careless things in a backyard is not the same as a woman who deserves to be blindsided the way I once was, over a pot roast, by a husband who had already decided months earlier that their marriage was ending. I did not want to become, in this story, the kind of woman who takes her pain out on the next woman standing closest to it. I have watched too many women do that, and I have never once seen it end in anything but more women hurting each other while the man at the center walked away clean. Danielle answered on the third ring, her voice bright and slightly wary, the way people sound when a number they don't fully expect shows up on their screen. Regina. Hi, is everything okay? Is it Zooey? Zooey's fine, I said. I'm calling about something else, and I want you to know up front that I'm not calling to cause trouble in your marriage. I'm calling because I think you deserve information that concerns you directly, and I would want someone to extend me the same courtesy if our positions were reversed. There was a pause, the particular pause of someone bracing for something they don't yet understand the shape of. Okay, she said slowly. You're kind of scaring me, Regina. Do you know a woman named Marguerite Beaumont? The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that I checked whether the call had dropped. Why are you asking me that? Danielle said finally, and her voice had lost its brightness entirely. Because her name is attached to a property Terrence purchased 18 months ago, I said, keeping my own voice level, informational, the voice I use when explaining fabric maintenance to a client rather than delivering devastating news to my ex-husband's wife. A townhouse in Alexandria, purchased through an LLC, funded in part by a withdrawal from a retirement account that was legally supposed to be divided between Terence and me during our divorce. The purchase happened 4 months before your wedding. That can't be right. Terence told me about an investment property. He said it was with a business partner. A real estate contact. I don't doubt that's what he told you, I said gently. I'm only telling you what the county property records show, and what my attorney has confirmed. I don't know the nature of his relationship with Marguerite Beaumont. I genuinely don't. But I thought you deserved to know her name exists in his financial life, in case it means something to you that it doesn't mean to me. There was a long silence, and when Danielle spoke again, her voice had changed entirely, the polished brightness gone, replaced by something smaller, younger, more uncertain than I had ever heard from her. He's been distracted for months. I thought it was work stress. I found a receipt in his jacket a few weeks ago, from a restaurant in Alexandria. On a night he told me he was golfing. I didn't say anything. I told myself I was being paranoid. I said nothing. I had not called to build a case against Terence through his new wife's confessions, and I was careful not to lead her any further than she was willing to go on her own. Regina, Danielle said, and her voice cracked slightly on my name in a way it never had at the birthday party. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me, because I don't think anyone else in this family will be. Did he do this to you too? While you were married? Is this just what he does? I sat with the question for a long moment before I answered it, because I understood, in that pause, that Danielle was not asking me to confirm gossip. She was asking me, quietly, desperately, to tell her whether the ground she believed she was standing on had ever been solid for anyone. I don't know the full truth of what he did during our marriage, and it isn't fair for me to speculate, I said carefully. What I can tell you is that I spent 26 years believing certain things about my life that turned out, in the end, not to be entirely true. I'm not telling you this to frighten you, Danielle. I'm telling you because 2 years ago, at your wedding, I stood in a hallway and wished you nothing but happiness. And I meant it. I still mean it. But I would never forgive myself if I found out something like this and said nothing, simply because it might be uncomfortable for me to be the one who told you. The line was quiet for a long moment. When Danielle finally spoke, her voice had steadied into something colder, more decisive. I need to go, Regina. Thank you for calling. I mean that. She hung up before I could respond. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time afterward, the phone dark in front of me, feeling neither triumphant nor cruel, only strangely, quietly still, the particular stillness that comes after you've done something you know is right, even though you cannot yet see where it will lead. I did not hear from Danielle again that night. I did not hear from Terence either, which struck me, at the time, as the loudest silence of all. It was Trey who called me the next morning, his voice tight with an urgency I had rarely heard from him. Mom, Dad just called me. Danielle's gone. She left the house last night with a suitcase, and she won't answer his calls. He wants to know if you know anything about it. I looked out my kitchen window at the yard I had planted myself, the one Terence had never once helped me weed in 26 years, and I felt something settle into place that had been unsettled for longer than I could remember. Tell your father, I said quietly, that I think it's time he and I had a conversation. In person, with Dominique present. The meeting took place 4 days later, in a small conference room at Dominique's office. Around a table too polished to have ever hosted a conversation this uncomfortable, Terence arrived alone, in the grey suit he used to wear to important client presentations. The one that meant he had decided, before walking in, exactly how composed he intended to appear. He did not look composed. He looked, for the first time in longer than I could remember, genuinely tired. Regina, he said, taking the seat across from me, Dominique settling into the chair at the head of the table with a folder already open in front of her. Before anything else gets said in this room, I want you to know Danielle leaving has nothing to do with any of this. We are working through some things privately. This is a separate conversation. I don't believe those two things are as separate as you'd like them to be, I said, But I'm not here to discuss your marriage, Terence. I'm here to discuss mine, or rather, the one that legally ended 2 years ago, and the portion of it you apparently never considered finished. Dominique slid a folder across the table. Mr. Calloway, I'll walk you through what we've found, and then I'd like to hear your explanation before we discuss how we'd like to proceed. The qualified domestic relations order dividing your 401k with Mrs. Calloway was never executed with the plan administrator. In the 2 years since, 3 withdrawals were made from that account totaling $58,400. Additionally, 18 months ago, a down payment of $110,000 was wired from that same account to fund the purchase of a property in Alexandria, held under an LLC in which you are listed as sole managing member, alongside a co-manager named Marguerite Beaumont. Terence's face did something complicated, a flicker of the practiced calm I recognized from 26 years of watching him navigate difficult rooms, followed by something raw underneath it. Something closer to a man realizing the room he'd walked into was not the one he'd prepared for. The QDRO not being filed was an administrative error, he said finally. My attorney's office handled that filing. I had no idea it hadn't gone through until this week, when Trey mentioned, Mr. Calloway, Dominique said evenly, the withdrawals from the account required your active authorization each time. An unfiled QDRO would explain why the account remained in your name. It does not explain 3 separate decisions to withdraw funds from an account you knew, or should have known, was not entirely yours to draw from. Terence was quiet for a long moment, and I watched him do something I had not seen him do in all our years together: search for words and come up empty. Who is Marguerite Beaumont? I asked, and I kept my voice level, informational, the same voice I had used with Danielle days earlier. He looked at me for a long moment, and something in his face finally cracked open, the practiced composure giving way to something closer to exhaustion. She's a real estate agent. I met her 4 years ago, at a closing for a client of the firm. 4 years ago, I repeated slowly. That would be before you told me, over dinner, that our marriage felt stagnant. Regina, was there ever a version of our marriage that wasn't already ending long before you said the word to my face? Terence looked down at the table, and for the first time in this entire process, I watched him choose honesty over management. Marguerite and I were involved, briefly, before I said anything to you about the marriage. It ended before the divorce was finalized. I told myself it wasn't relevant to what happened between us, because it was over before Danielle. I convinced myself the property was just business. A good investment opportunity Marguerite brought to me. And it didn't matter where the down payment came from because I intended to make it right eventually. Once the QDRO was filed, which you knew hadn't happened, because you were the one benefiting from it not happening, Dominique finished for him, not unkindly, simply factually. The room was quiet. I looked at the man I had built 26 years of my life around, and I felt, to my own surprise, not the fury I might have expected from myself 2 years earlier, but something closer to a strange, clarifying sadness, the particular grief of finally seeing clearly a picture you had spent decades only half looking at. Terence, I said quietly, I'm not here to punish you for who you loved or when. People's hearts do what they do, and I made my peace with the end of our marriage a long time ago. What I cannot make peace with is a man who let his ex-wife stand in his son's backyard, humiliated by his current wife, while quietly sitting on nearly $200,000 that was never his alone to keep. He did not answer that. There was nothing, I think, that could have answered it. Dominique laid out the path forward with the same measured clarity she brought to everything. A corrected QDRO filed immediately, restitution for the withdrawn funds plus accrued interest, and a formal accounting of the Alexandria property's value, with my legal share of the initial investment returned in full, given that it had been funded, provably, with marital assets I had never consented to have used that way. Terence did not fight it. I think, by that point, some tired part of him understood there was no version of a fight he could win. As the meeting closed and Dominique gathered her folder, Terence lingered at the door. And for a moment I saw something in his face that reminded me, unwillingly, of the young man I had married 30 years earlier before ambition and comfort had worn certain rooms of him hollow. Regina, he said quietly. For what it's worth, and I know it isn't worth much, given everything, I am sorry. Not just for the money, for all of it, for how small I let this family make you feel, when you were never the small one in this. I looked at him for a long moment. I did not offer forgiveness, because I have learned that forgiveness offered too quickly is often just another form of managing someone else's comfort at your own expense. But I did nod once, because I believed, in that moment, that he meant it. "Thank you for saying that," I said. "I hope you figure out, eventually, what made you so afraid of being ordinary, with someone who loved you enough to help you become extraordinary." I drove home that afternoon with the windows down, the late spring air moving through the car in a way that felt, for the first time in 2 years, less like grief, and more like room to breathe. My phone buzzed as I pulled into my driveway. A text from Trey. "Mom, Danielle just called me. She wants to know if she can talk to you. Just the two of you. She said it's important." I sat in my driveway for a long moment, engine off, staring at the message, understanding that whatever Danielle wanted to say to me next would likely be the beginning of an entirely different conversation than the one I had just walked out of, one that had far less to do with money, and far more to do with two women who had, in their own separate ways, spent years underestimated by the same man. Danielle asked to meet at a small coffee shop in Old Town Alexandria, neutral ground for both of us. And when I arrived, she was already seated in the corner, her hands wrapped around a cup she wasn't drinking from, looking nothing like the polished woman who had introduced me to a stranger as the one who couldn't keep him 2 weeks earlier. "Thank you for coming," she said, standing briefly, then sitting back down as though she wasn't sure the gesture had been appropriate. "I wasn't sure you would. You said it was important." I sat across from her, ordering nothing, because I had not come for coffee. Danielle was quiet for a moment, turning her cup slowly on the table, and when she finally spoke, her voice had none of the bright carelessness I remembered from the birthday party. "I want to apologize for what I said about you. At's party. I've replayed it 100 times since, and I don't even fully understand why I said it, except that I think I needed you to be smaller than me. It made it easier to feel secure in my marriage if the woman before me had somehow failed at something I was succeeding at. I didn't think about what that meant for you, standing there. I'm sorry, genuinely." I let the apology sit for a moment before responding, because I have learned that receiving an apology gracefully does not require pretending the original wound didn't happen. "Thank you for saying that. It did hurt, more than I let on that day, but I didn't come here today for an apology about the party, Danielle. I imagine you have other things on your mind." She let out a short, humorless laugh. "I moved out of the house 4 days ago. I'm staying with my sister. I confronted Terence about Marguerite the night you called me, and he didn't deny it. He tried to explain it away as something that ended before we got together. But Regina, I found messages. Recent ones. It didn't end before us. It never really ended at all." I said nothing, because there was nothing useful I could add to that particular grief. I recognized the shape of it too well. "I keep thinking about something you said on the phone," Danielle continued. "You said you spent 26 years believing things about your life that turned out not to be true. I thought I understood what that meant when you said it. I don't think I actually understood it until 4 days ago." She looked up at me, and for the first time since I'd known her, her expression held nothing performed in it at all. "Was it like this for you? At the end? Did it feel like the ground just stopped being there?" "Yes," I said simply. "It felt exactly like that." "How did you survive it?" I thought about the question for a long moment, because I understood she wasn't asking it rhetorically. She was asking me, a woman she had wronged carelessly weeks earlier, to hand her something she could actually use. I let myself grieve the marriage honestly, instead of performing that I was fine before I actually was, I said. And then, once I'd done that, I built something that had nothing to do with him. A business. A life. A version of myself that existed entirely independent of whether Terence Calloway approved of it. It didn't happen quickly. And there were nights I'm not proud of, where I sat in an empty house wondering what was wrong with me that hadn't been enough to keep a marriage together. But eventually I understood something that I don't think anyone tells women my age nearly often enough: the marriage ending wasn't a referendum on my worth. It was information about his character, arriving several decades later than it should have. Danielle was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something that surprised me. I always assumed you must have done something, or been something, that drove him away. He never said that outright, but the way he talked about you, distant, dismissive, like you were a chapter he'd already closed. I filled in the gaps myself. I'm ashamed of that now. You weren't the only one who filled in those gaps, I said. He was very good at managing what people believed about our marriage. I don't think you're the villain in this story, Danielle. And I don't think I ever really did, even that day at the party. I think you married a man who is skilled at making the people around him believe whatever version of events keeps him most comfortable. That's not a flaw unique to you. That's just what happens when you fall for someone who's had a lot of practice. We sat together for a while after that, two women who had, in their own separate decades, loved and lost the same man in remarkably similar shapes, and there was a strange, unexpected peace in it. Not friendship, not yet, but something adjacent to it, the particular understanding that only exists between people who have survived a nearly identical wound. Before Danielle left, she said one more thing that stayed with me for days afterward. Z asked about you last week. She wanted to know if Grandma Regina was still coming to her dance recital next month. I told her of course you were. I want you to know whatever happens with Terence and me, whatever this family looks like 6 months from now, I'm not going to be the reason you kept from your granddaughter. That was never mine to decide, and I understand now that it never should have felt like it was. I drove home that evening with a lightness in my chest I hadn't expected. The retirement account was being corrected, the Alexandria property was being liquidated, with my share returned in full. Terence's second marriage appeared to be crumbling under the weight of its own foundation. And yet none of those things, I realized, were actually the source of the peace I felt settling into me. The peace came from something quieter, the understanding that I had walked through the worst of it without losing the parts of myself that mattered, and had, somewhere along the way, without entirely meaning to, become the kind of woman who extended grace to someone who had wronged her, simply because it was the right thing to do, not because it was owed. 2 weeks later, my phone rang with a call I hadn't expected. Marguerite Beaumont's name appeared on my caller ID, having somehow gotten my number through the property dispute paperwork, and when I answered, her voice was tight, urgent, entirely unlike the composed real estate professional I'd imagined from Trey's description. Mrs. Calloway, she said, I know you have no reason to talk to me, and I know how this looks, but I need to tell you something about Terence that I don't think you know yet, and I think you deserve to hear it before his attorney finishes reviewing that settlement paperwork. Marguerite Beaumont and I met the following afternoon at a diner off Route 1, a place neither of us had any connection to, chosen deliberately for its distance from everyone we knew. She was younger than I expected, not much older than Danielle, actually with the composed, professional bearing of someone who had spent a career learning to project confidence even when she didn't feel it. I want to be upfront, she said, before I'd even finished sitting down. I'm not calling you out of guilt about the affair, or whatever this looks like from the outside. I'm calling because Terence asked me to do something 2 days ago that I'm not willing to do, and I think you should know what it was. I'm listening. His attorney reached out to me, on his behalf, asking if I'd be willing to sign a document backdating the LLC formation to make it appear the Alexandria property was solely my initiative, that I purchased it independently and merely brought him on as a passive investor after the fact, rather than the reverse. If I sign it, it shifts the legal exposure for using marital funds almost entirely onto me, as though I orchestrated the whole purchase, and he simply contributed money to an investment I'd already structured. I sat with that for a moment. Why would he need that, if the settlement Dominique laid out already accounts for the funds being returned? Marguerite's jaw tightened. Because it's not just the Alexandria property, Mrs. Calloway. There's more. She slid a folder across the table. The second time in 2 weeks someone had handed me a folder that reorganized my understanding of the last several years of my life. Inside were printed emails between Terence and a financial advisor at his company, dated over the past 3 years, discussing the structuring of deferred stock compensation in a way that kept a significant portion of it classified as unvested and non-marital. During our divorce discovery, despite, according to Marguerite, informal conversations Terence had had with her about the shares being effectively guaranteed by his role at the firm, regardless of the technical vesting schedule. I only know about this because he mentioned it once, bragging, honestly, about how clever his financial advisor had been in the divorce paperwork, Marguerite said. I didn't think much of it at the time. I wasn't thinking about you at all, if I'm being honest, which I know doesn't reflect well on me. But when his attorney asked me to falsify documents to protect him from the current situation, something in me finally said enough. I've spent 3 years letting this man convince me I was the reasonable, understanding one in an impossible situation. I'm done being reasonable on his behalf. I want to pause here and say something, because I think it matters. I did not feel triumphant sitting in that diner, learning that the scope of what Terence had hidden during our divorce was larger than even Dominique had uncovered. I felt, instead, a kind of tired clarity, the specific exhaustion of understanding that the man I had spent 26 years married to had built an entire architecture of concealment so practiced, so casual, that he could mention it to his mistress as a point of pride. Will you go on record with Dominique about this? I asked. I understand what it might cost you. Marguerite was quiet for a long moment. It'll end whatever's left of my relationship with him. It might complicate my real estate license if this becomes a bigger legal matter than any of us want it to be. But yes, I'll go on record. I have copies of everything already sent to my personal email, dated, so there's no question of tampering. Before I go on with what happened next, let me ask you something, because I think it's the quiet center of this entire story. Have you ever discovered that the person who wronged you had built an entire hidden structure of deception so casual to him that other people became collateral in it without even realizing they'd been recruited? I have a feeling that kind of discovery changes something permanent in how you see a person, no matter how many years you once loved them. Dominique reopened the discovery process within the week, filing a motion to compel full financial disclosure based on the new evidence. And what emerged over the following month painted a picture even I hadn't fully anticipated. The deferred stock compensation, once properly valued, represented an additional $210,000 in marital assets that had never been disclosed during our original divorce proceedings, assets that, under the law, I was entitled to a substantial portion of, regardless of how cleverly they had been classified on paper. Terence's attorney attempted, briefly, to argue that the classification had been a good-faith legal interpretation rather than deliberate concealment. That argument collapsed the moment Dominique introduced Marguerite's sworn statement, along with the emails documenting Terence's own awareness that the shares were, in practice if not on paper, guaranteed. I did not attend most of these proceedings in person. I had, by that point, largely handed the mechanics over to Dominique, trusting her the way I had learned, slowly and expensively, to trust people who had earned it. I spent that month instead doing something that felt far more important to me than watching a courtroom untangle numbers. I spent it with Z. Trey had started bringing her by the store on Wednesday afternoons, ostensibly so I could babysit while he handled a work emergency, though I suspected, and never asked, whether this was simply his quiet way of making sure his daughter and his mother had uninterrupted time together during a season when so much of the adult world around her was quietly rearranging itself. Zoo would sit on the floor of my showroom with a box of fabric scraps, building elaborate, nonsensical little kingdoms out of velvet and linen, narrating stories to herself in the particular, unself-conscious way 5-year-olds do, and I would work at my desk nearby, listening, feeling something in my chest settle each time she looked up to show me some small, triumphant discovery, a fabric that felt like a bunny, a color that matched her favorite dress. "Grandma," she said to me one Wednesday, apropos of nothing, "are you and Grandpa still married?" "No, sweetheart. We haven't been married for a little while now." She considered this with the grave seriousness 5-year-olds bring to questions adults assume are simple. "Is that why the lady at my party said you couldn't keep him?" I set down the fabric swatch in my hands. "You heard that?" "I heard some of it. I didn't understand it," Trey said. She caught herself, correcting to the more formal address her parents insisted on. "Daddy said it wasn't a nice thing to say, and I shouldn't repeat it. But I wanted to ask you if it made you sad." I looked at my granddaughter, 5 years old, sitting cross-legged on my showroom floor surrounded by velvet scraps, asking me with more directness and compassion than most adults had managed in the 2 weeks since the party, and I felt something in my chest loosen that had been tight since Danielle's sentence first landed in that backyard. It did make me a little sad, for a moment, I said honestly, because I have never believed in lying to children about feelings, only in teaching them how to hold feelings without being ruled by them. But you know what I learned? Sometimes people say unkind things because they don't understand the whole story. And the whole story is that I didn't lose anything by not staying married to your grandfather. I built this whole store with my own 2 hands. I get to see you every Wednesday. I get to pick out beautiful fabric all day. That doesn't sound like someone who lost, does it? Z considered this with the same gravity, then held up a scrap of deep green velvet. This one feels like a dragon, she announced, apparently satisfied with my answer, and returned to her kingdom building without further comment. The particular gift children have of taking exactly what they need from a conversation, and leaving the rest behind without ceremony. I did not know, that Wednesday afternoon, that within 2 weeks, the final piece of Terence's carefully constructed story would come apart entirely, not through Dominique's discovery motions, not through Marguerite's sworn statement, but through a phone call from Terence's own employer, informing him that the same financial irregularities being examined in his divorce proceedings had triggered an internal compliance review at the firm where he had built his entire professional reputation. The call from Terence's employer came on a Thursday, and I learned about it not from Terence, but from Trey, who arrived at my house that evening looking like a man carrying something too heavy for one trip. "Dad's been placed on administrative leave," he said, sitting at my kitchen table without being invited to, the way he used to as a teenager, when something had gone wrong at school, and he needed the neutral ground of my kitchen before he could find the words for it. Compliance flagged the financial statements from his divorce proceedings. Apparently there's some overlap between how he classified his deferred comp for the divorce and how the firm reported it for his own executive filings. They are auditing everything now. He could lose his job over this, Mom, not just the money, the actual job. I sat across from my son, feeling something complicated move through me, not the satisfaction I might have expected, not vindication exactly, but something closer to the particular sorrow of watching consequences finally arrive for someone you once loved, consequences that were entirely earned and still somehow difficult to witness without feeling something. "How are you doing with all of this?" I asked, because I understood that whatever this cost Terence, Trey was the one left holding the complicated inheritance of loving a flawed father while also loving a mother that father had wronged. Trey was quiet for a long moment, turning a coffee mug in his hands the way he'd turned it at my store weeks earlier. "I keep thinking about something you said to me, actually, about how you didn't want me carrying this alone. I think I've spent my whole adult life trying to hold both of you evenly, like if I just stayed neutral enough, I wouldn't have to actually look at what happened. But I can't do that anymore. Not after everything I've learned these past few weeks." He looked up at me. "He hurt you, Mom, really hurt you, and I think some part of me knew that even when the divorce first happened, and I let myself believe it was just two people growing apart, because that story was easier to live inside than the real one." "You don't have to stop loving your father to acknowledge what he did," I said gently. "Those two things aren't in conflict, sweetheart. I would never ask you to choose sides between us. But I think you're allowed to be angry at him, and disappointed in him, while still being his son. That's not disloyalty. That's just what it looks like to see a parent clearly, as a whole, flawed person, instead of as a myth you built to protect your own peace." Trey nodded slowly, and something in his shoulders eased, the way I imagined mine had eased weeks earlier in Dominique's office. The particular relief of finally being permitted to feel the true size of something instead of managing it down to a size more comfortable for everyone else. The settlement, when it finally concluded 3 weeks later, was more thorough than even Dominique had initially projected. The corrected QDRO restored my rightful share of the original retirement account. The Alexandria property was liquidated, with my portion of the improperly used funds returned in full, plus statutory interest, and the newly discovered deferred compensation, once properly valued and divided, added an additional payment that Dominique described, with the closest thing to enthusiasm I'd heard from her in weeks, as a very favorable outcome, given where we started. I want to be honest about something, because I think stories like this one sometimes skip past an important truth in favor of a clean, triumphant number at the end. The money mattered.It mattered practically. It meant I could finally stop worrying, at 54, whether I'd built enough of a cushion for the years ahead, whether the store could weather a slow season, whether I'd have to lean on Trey in ways neither of us wanted. But sitting in Dominique's office the day the settlement was finalized, signing the last of the paperwork, I understood that the money was not actually the thing that had changed in me over the past 2 months. What had changed was quieter and harder to put a number on. I had stopped being a woman who absorbed carelessness quietly, out of some inherited belief that grace meant silence. I had learned, at 54, a lesson I wished someone had taught me 30 years earlier: that dignity and vigilance were never opposites, that watching closely for what you owed is not the same as being small or ungracious, and that the version of me who smiled politely in that backyard while a stranger's careless sentence tried to diminish me had been, all along, quietly building the exact resources she'd need to make sure it was the last time anyone ever tried. Terrence's employer ultimately did not terminate him, though Trey told me the audit resulted in a formal reprimand, a demotion from his director role, and what Trey described as a very different dad than the one I grew up with, quieter, a lot less certain of himself. I did not take pleasure in his diminishment, exactly, though I won't pretend there wasn't a certain settling of accounts in it that felt, if not satisfying, at least fair. Danielle filed for divorce 2 weeks after our conversation at the coffee shop, and I heard, through Trey, that she had moved into a small apartment near her sister and started, tentatively, rebuilding a version of her own life independent of the marriage she'd entered, believing it would be permanent. I sent her a text the week her divorce was finalized, nothing elaborate, just a short message letting her know that if she ever wanted advice from someone who'd walked a version of this road before, my door was open. She wrote back a single line that I've thought about often since: "Thank you for treating me better than I treated you. I won't forget it." Marguerite Beaumont's cooperation with the discovery process, ironically, ended up protecting her more than exposing her. Her sworn testimony was framed by Dominique not as an admission of wrongdoing, but as a woman coming forward once she understood the full scope of what she'd been asked to help conceal. She kept her real estate license. She kept her dignity, in the end, which I suspect mattered to her more than either of those first 2 things. And I kept building. 6 weeks after the settlement, Callaway and Rowe landed its largest contract yet, a full commercial redesign for a boutique hotel opening in Old Town, the kind of project that would have felt impossibly out of reach to me 2 years earlier, sitting in a guest bedroom of the house I'd built my whole married life around, wondering what was left of me once the marriage ended. I was standing in my showroom late one evening, reviewing fabric samples for the hotel project under the good lamp, when my phone buzzed with a text from an unfamiliar number. I opened it, expecting a client inquiry, and found instead a single line that stopped me entirely. "This is Marguerite. I know it's strange to hear from me again, but there's something I think you deserve to know about your original divorce settlement, something that happened before I was ever involved with Terrence, that I only just found out about myself." I called Marguerite back within the hour, sitting in the quiet of my showroom with the fabric samples for the hotel project still spread across my desk, and she answered on the first ring, as though she'd been waiting with the phone in her hand. "I want to be careful here," she said, "because I don't want to hand you something half-formed and let it become another 2 months of uncertainty. But I think you deserve to hear this directly from me rather than through a paper trail that takes weeks to assemble. Go ahead." Before I ever met Terrence, I did some real estate work for a woman named Patricia Ellsworth. She handled a property closing for a client of mine, back when she still had her own practice. Last week, cleaning out old files before I finally get out of the real estate business entirely, I found some correspondence between her and Terrence's original divorce attorney. Regina, they weren't just opposing counsel exchanging routine paperwork. There were emails discussing a referral arrangement. Terrence's attorney sent business to Patricia's firm on other matters, unrelated cases, 4 years, and in one email, dated right around the time your original divorce settlement was being finalized, Terrence's attorney thanks Patricia for. And I'm reading this directly, keeping things moving smoothly on the Callaway matter. I sat very still, the fabric samples blurring slightly in my peripheral vision. Patricia was my attorney, I said slowly. The one who handled my original divorce. She retired and handed her clients to Dominique. I know, Marguerite said. I recognized the name the moment I saw it in the file. I didn't know what it meant at first, and I want to be honest, I still don't know exactly what it means. It could be nothing professional courtesy between attorneys who cross paths regularly. But given everything else that's come out about how sloppily your original QDRO was handled, and given that Patricia was the one responsible for reviewing and finalizing that paperwork, I thought you deserved to know there might have been a reason your own attorney wasn't looking as closely at the details as she should have been. I thought about Patricia Kind, overworked, the woman who had handled 40 cases at once, and I had always assumed, simply lacked the bandwidth to catch every detail in my file. I had never once considered that her inattention might not have been merely a matter of an overloaded caseload. I called Dominique first thing the next morning, and she was quiet for a long moment after I explained what Marguerite had found. This is significant, Regina. If it's what it looks like. A referral relationship between opposing counsel doesn't automatically prove misconduct. But if Patricia's firm was receiving business from Terence's attorney's firm at the same time she was representing you against that same attorney, that's a conflict of interest she was obligated to disclose to you. If she didn't disclose it, and if it can be shown to have affected the competency of her representation, the missed QDRO filing, the undervaluation that let the deferred comp slip through, you may have grounds to revisit portions of the original settlement that we haven't even touched yet. I don't want to spend the next year of my life relitigating a marriage that ended 2 years ago, I said, and I meant it. There's a point I was discovering, past which the pursuit of what you're owed stops being about dignity and starts becoming its own kind of prison. And I did not want to become a woman defined entirely by an ongoing excavation of old wrongs. I understand, Dominique said. And for what it's worth, I don't think you need to, based on what we've already recovered: the QDRO correction, the Alexandria property, the deferred compensation. You're in a strong position regardless of what happened with Patricia. My recommendation would be this. We send a formal inquiry to the State Bar regarding the potential conflict of interest, which protects other clients who might be in Patricia's position without your knowledge, and we let the professional consequences of that play out through the appropriate channels, rather than reopening your entire settlement. You've already recovered what was rightfully yours. You don't have to recover justice for every wrong that touched this case in order to have already won. I sat with that advice for a long time after we hung up, turning it over the way I'd turned over so many difficult things these past 2 months, and I understood, with a clarity that felt like relief rather than resignation, that Dominique was right. There's a difference between pursuing what you are owed and becoming permanently defined by the pursuit of it. And I had come dangerously close, in the exhaustion of these past weeks, to losing sight of that difference. I filed the bar complaint. I did not pursue reopening the broader settlement, and I made a decision, sitting in my showroom that afternoon, that felt more important than any single dollar amount recovered in the entire process. I decided that this would be the last thread I pulled on, whatever else Terence had hidden, whatever else the divorce had obscured. I was done excavating it. I had enough. I had, finally, enough. That evening, I drove to Trey and Brianna's house for the first time in weeks without any legal update to deliver, without any new revelation waiting to reshape someone's understanding of the past several years, simply to have dinner with my son's family, the way I used to before any of this began. Ze met me at the door in her dance recital costume, spinning in place to show me the skirt, and Brianna caught my eye over her daughter's head with a small, warm smile that had none of the careful neutrality I'd grown used to seeing on her face these past 2 years. Regina, she said quietly, once they had spun off toward the living room, I want you to know I've been proud of how you've handled all of this, really proud, and I'm sorry I didn't say anything sooner. At the party, when Danielle, you don't owe me an apology, Brianna, I said, and meant it fully. You were kind to me long before any of this started, and you'll be kind to me long after it's finished. That's worth more to me than anyone standing up for me in the moment. Brianna hugged me then, unprompted, the first time she'd done so in the 2 years since the divorce, and over her shoulder I watched Sue twirling in her recital costume in the living room, utterly unaware that the adults around her had spent the past 2 months quietly rebuilding the foundation of the family she was growing up inside of. Not the family it had been, but perhaps, I was beginning to believe, a sturdier one than it had ever managed to be before. 6 months passed in the way that Meaningful stretches of time often do not in a single dramatic sweep, but in the accumulation of ordinary Wednesdays, ordinary client meetings, ordinary dinners with Trey's family that slowly stopped feeling like they required careful navigation. Callaway and Rowe finished the boutique hotel project in early autumn, and the finished space all warm brass fixtures and deep emerald upholstery. Exactly the kind of room I would have wanted to sit in myself earned a small feature in a regional design magazine that led to 3 new commercial inquiries within a month. I hired my first employee that October, a sharp young woman named Priyanka, fresh out of a design program, and there was something quietly moving about training someone else in a craft I had built entirely by trial and error. Alone, in the years since my marriage ended, Terence, I learned through the particular filtered channel of family updates that Trey carefully curated for both of us, had settled into a quieter version of his professional life, the demotion holding a smaller title, a noticeably smaller presence at family gatherings, though he still came to his events, still sent birthday cards, still occupied the strange, diminished role of a man whose worst instincts had finally caught up with the reputation he'd spent decades building. I ran into him only once during those 6 months. At Z's fall dance recital, both of us seated a few rows apart in the same auditorium, both of us there for the same small spinning girl in a sequined leotard. He nodded to me as the lights dimmed, a small, careful gesture, neither warm nor hostile, simply the acknowledgement of 2 people who had once built an entire life together and now shared only the fragile, precious common ground of a granddaughter. I want to pause here, because I think this is the part of the story that matters most, even though it isn't the most dramatic. So much of what makes stories like mine feel satisfying is the reckoning, the moment the wrongdoer faces consequences, the moment the truth comes to light, but the actual texture of healing, the part that happens after the reckoning, is quieter than that, and I think it deserves its own honest telling. Healing did not arrive for me as a single triumphant moment. It arrived as the slow accumulation of ordinary days where Terence Callaway simply stopped being the center of gravity around which my thoughts organized themselves. It was Dominique, of all people, who first mentioned Marcus Whitaker to me, not the ex-husband from an earlier draft of a title we'd considered, but an actual man, a client referral, an architect who'd worked with her firm on several cases involving property disputes and had, apparently, asked after me by name following a deposition where I'd handled myself, in his words, with more composure than most attorneys I know. He asked if you were single, Dominique said, with the particular dryness of a woman who does not typically involve herself in her clients' romantic lives, but had decided, in this instance, to make an exception. I told him I couldn't discuss client matters, but that I'd mention his interest if the opportunity arose, consider it mentioned. I laughed the suggestion off for nearly a month before Priyanka, of all people, cornered me in the showroom one afternoon while I was avoiding the question entirely by reorganizing fabric swatches that didn't need reorganizing. Can I say something, Regina, even though I've worked here for like 6 weeks and it's probably not my place? Go ahead. You built this entire business out of the wreckage of something that would have flattened most people. You've spent the last 6 months teaching me that good design is about creating rooms where people feel safe enough to actually live their lives, instead of just performing for guests. But I've noticed you don't seem to believe that applies to your own life. You built yourself this beautiful, safe room, and now you won't let anyone else sit in it with you. I did not have a ready answer for that, which told me, more than anything else could have, that she had touched something true. I agreed to meet Marcus Whitaker for coffee 3 weeks later, on a grey Saturday morning in November, expecting very little and prepared, if I'm honest, to enjoy an hour of pleasant conversation and nothing more. He was 58. An architect who had lost his wife to illness 4 years earlier rather than divorce, which meant our griefs, though entirely different in shape, shared a certain common vocabulary, the particular fluency of people who have rebuilt an entire life from a foundation they never chose to have cracked. Dominique told me you handled yourself well in a deposition, I said, mostly to fill the silence, mostly to avoid admitting how nervous I felt sitting across from a stranger for reasons that had nothing to do with contracts or fabric orders. She told me the same about you, he said, Though I understand your deposition involved considerably higher stakes than mine. A conflict of interest complaint against your original divorce attorney, if I heard correctly. You heard correctly. I found myself, to my own surprise, telling him the whole story, not the abbreviated, protective version I gave to acquaintances, but the real shape of it, the party, the sentence, the retirement account, the townhouse, Marguerite, Danielle, Patricia. He listened without interrupting, without flinching, without offering the kind of hollow reassurance people often reach for when a story makes them uncomfortable. I think, he said, once I'd finished, that most people, faced with what you described, would have spent the last 6 months becoming smaller and angrier. You spent it becoming a woman who trains employees and gets featured in design magazines. I find that considerably more interesting than anger would have been. I did not fall in love with Marcus Whitaker over a single cup of coffee on a grey November Saturday. I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like mine sometimes rush toward a tidy romantic conclusion in a way that flattens something more important: the fact that I did not need Marcus, or anyone, to complete a story that I had already finished writing myself. But I did agree to a second coffee, and a third. And by the time winter arrived, I found myself, cautiously, allowing a new person room in a life I had spent 2 years deliberately, carefully rebuilding to require no one's permission, but my OWN.It was at Thanksgiving, hosted that year not by Trey and Brianna, but by me, in the house I had built my whole married life around and now filled entirely with choices that were mine alone, that Zoe looked up from the kids' table seated, this time, exactly where she wanted to be, surrounded by cousins and coloring books, nowhere near the periphery of anything, and asked a question that made the entire table go quiet. Grandma, is Marcus your boyfriend now? I looked across the table at Marcus, who had come at my invitation, who was carefully, patiently earning his place among people who had every reason to be cautious of new additions to this particular family story. And I found myself smiling in a way that had nothing performed in it at all. I think he might be, sweetheart, I said. Would that be all right with you? Z considered this with the same grave seriousness she'd once brought to the question of whether I'd lost anything by not staying married to her grandfather, and then she shrugged, entirely satisfied. Okay. As long as he doesn't make you sad like that other lady did. The table laughed, the particular warm laughter of a family that had survived something difficult together and come out the other side with its capacity for lightness intact, and I looked around at Trey, at Brianna, at Zoe, at Marcus's steady, patient presence beside me, and understood that I was sitting in exactly the room I had spent 2 years, without fully realizing it, building toward. The State Bar's response to my complaint against Patricia arrived in early December, in a formal letter that Dominique read aloud to me over the phone, with the particular clinical precision lawyers reserve for outcomes they consider significant, but expect their clients to feel more ambivalently about. They found the referral relationship constituted an undisclosed conflict of interest, Dominique said. Patricia has been issued a formal reprimand and is required to complete additional ethics training to maintain her license. It's not disbarment, Regina, and I want to manage your expectations there. These things rarely result in anything that dramatic. But it's on her record now, permanently, and any future client researching her will find it. I sat with the news for a while after we hung up, trying to locate the satisfaction I might have expected to feel, and finding instead something quieter and more complicated. Patricia had not been a villain in my story, not in the way Terence had been, not in the calculated way he'd structured LLCs and hidden compensation. She had been, I suspected, a tired, overworked woman who had accepted a professional courtesy from a colleague without fully reckoning with what it cost the client sitting across from her. A smaller, more human failure than Terence's, but a failure that had still cost me 2 years of uncertainty and nearly $200,000. I would never have recovered had my son not overheard a conversation through a half-open door. Do you regret filing it? Marcus asked me that evening, when I told him about the letter over dinner at my kitchen table, in the quiet, easy way our conversations had settled into over the preceding weeks. No, I said, after real consideration. I think about the next woman who might sit in Patricia's office someday, trusting her the way I once did, and I think she deserves better odds than I had. I don't need Patricia to suffer for what she did. I just needed the system to know it happened, so it's a little harder for it to happen again to someone else. Marcus nodded, and didn't offer platitudes, which was, I was discovering, one of the things I valued most about him, his willingness to let a complicated feeling simply exist in a room without rushing to resolve it into something tidier than it actually was. It was around this time that Trey came to me with news of his own, delivered over lunch at my store on a slow Tuesday, with the particular careful phrasing of a man who had learned, over the past 6 months, to choose his words with more precision than he once had. Dad asked me something last week, he said, pushing a sandwich around its plate without eating much of it. He wants to know if you'd be willing to have coffee with him, just the two of you. He said he has some things he wants to say that he doesn't think he said well enough back in Dominique's office. I considered this for a long moment. What do you think I should do? I don't think that's my call to make, Mom. I just wanted you to know, he asked, and I wanted you to know that whatever you decide, I'm not going to think less of you either way. If you want to close that door permanently, that's your right after everything. If you want to hear him out, that's your right too. I agreed to the coffee, not because I felt I owed Terence anything, but because I had come to believe, over the past 6 months, that closing a door with intention feels different than closing it out of avoidance, and I wanted whatever ending Terence and I arrived at to be the former. We met at a quiet cafe neither of us had any history with, much like my meeting with Danielle months earlier, and Terence looked, when I arrived, like a considerably older man than the one who had sat across from me at Zui's birthday party, not aged in body, but in something harder to name, the particular where that comes from finally being made to see yourself clearly. I wanted to say this properly, he said, once we'd settled in, because I don't think I did, back in Dominique's office. I spent 26 years married to you, and I spent most of those years assuming your steadiness meant you didn't need very much from me, that you were simply built that way, low maintenance, easy. It took losing everything I built afterward, the second marriage, most of my standing at the firm, a piece of my own son's trust in me, to understand that your steadiness was never the absence of need. It was the presence of extraordinary strength that I spent 26 years benefiting from without ever once properly acknowledging it. I let the words settle before responding, because I understood he had likely rehearsed them, and they deserved to be received rather than immediately answered. Thank you for saying that, I said finally. I don't know that it changes anything material between us now, but I believe you mean it, and I think that matters, for both of us, and especially for Trey and Zui. I don't expect it to change anything, he said. I think I just needed you to hear it directly from me, rather than through Trey, rather than through a settlement number. I am sorry, Regina, for the marriage, for after the marriage, for letting you become a punchline in a backyard I should have protected you in, at the very least, out of decency, if nothing else. We did not become friends that afternoon. I want to be honest about that, because I think there's a temptation, in stories like this one, to push toward a reconciliation tidier than reality typically allows. But we did arrive, I believe, at something quieter and more sustainable than friendship, a working peace, built on honest accounting rather than performed forgiveness, the kind of peace that could hold a granddaughter's birthday parties and dance recitals and holiday gatherings for years to come without either of us needing to pretend the past hadn't happened. Walking to my car afterward, I thought about the woman who had sat in that backyard 8 months earlier, absorbing a stranger's careless cruelty with a practiced smile, and I understood, with the particular clarity that only comes from having actually walked all the way through something, that she had not been weak in that moment. She had simply been a woman who did not yet know her own strength, had already begun, quietly, to reorganize the entire shape of her life around something far sturdier than anyone in that yard had given her credit for. Winter deepened into the kind of quiet, ordinary rhythm I had once thought I'd lost the capacity to trust, the store humming along steadily, Priyanka handling more of the day-to-day design consultations as her confidence grew, Marcus a steady, unhurried presence in the evenings, Zui's Wednesday visits stretching into full afternoons now that Trey trusted the arrangement enough to stop hovering nearby, just in case. It was Danielle who called me in late January, her voice carrying a lightness I hadn't heard from her since our conversation at the coffee shop months earlier. I have news, and I wanted you to hear it from me before it made its way to you secondhand, she said. I'm engaged. His name is David. He's an elementary school teacher, which is about as far from Terrence's world as I could possibly have landed, and I think that's exactly why it works. Danielle, that's wonderful, I said, and I meant it fully, without the complicated undertow I might have expected to feel even a year earlier. I wanted to ask you something, she continued, a little hesitant now. Would it be strange if I invited you to the wedding? I know it's an unusual request, given everything, but you were the only person who ever spoke to me honestly during the worst weeks of my life, and I don't have very many people I'd call real in that particular chapter. I'd like you there, if you're willing. I sat with the request for a moment, turning it over the way I'd learned to turn over every significant decision since the birthday party that had started all of this. I'd be honored, I said finally, and found, to my own quiet surprise, that I meant that too. I want to pause here and say something about what this friendship with Danielle came to mean to me over that first year, because I think it's easy for stories about betrayal and reckoning to skip past the strange, unexpected grace notes that sometimes follow them. Danielle and I were never going to be close in the way old friends are close, but we had built something rarer, in its way an honest, unsentimental respect between two women who had loved the same flawed man in different decades of his life, and had chosen, in the end, not to let his failures turn them into each other's enemies. I have come to believe that this choice, refusing to let a man's carelessness become a war between the women he wronged, is one of the quieter, but more important victories available to us. One that the loudest versions of these stories rarely make room for. It was Marguerite, of all people, who reached out. Next, in early February, with a request that surprised me more than anything else that winter. She was leaving real estate entirely, she told me over the phone, moving into a smaller, quieter life, as a paralegal at a firm that specialized in exactly the kind of financial misconduct cases she'd found herself unwittingly entangled in. I wanted to ask if I could list you as a reference, she said. Not because we are close, Regina. I know we are not, and I understand if it's an uncomfortable request given how we first came to know of each other. But you're the only person from that entire chapter of my life who ever treated me like someone capable of doing the right thing, even after I'd been part of something that hurt you. I'd like the firm to know that about me, if you're willing to say it. I agreed, because I had come, by that winter, to understand something about grace that I don't think I fully grasped in the raw months right after Zoo's birthday party, that extending it to the people who wrong us, carefully, with clear eyes and without illusions about what happened, costs us far less than carrying bitterness does, and often gives something valuable back to us in return, even when we don't expect it to. It was Trey who brought me the last piece of unfinished business that winter. Arriving at my house on a Sunday afternoon with a folder of his own not legal paperwork this time, but a stack of old photographs he'd found while helping his father finally clear out the last of the family storage unit neither of them had touched since the divorce. I found these, he said, spreading them across my kitchen table, and I thought you should have them, because I don't think Dad even remembers half of them exist. They were photographs from decades earlier, me at 26, newly married, laughing at something just out of frame, me at 34, pregnant with Trey, standing in the doorway of the house I would spend the next 2 decades filling with a life, me at 42. At some forgotten holiday gathering, radiant in a way I barely recognized in myself anymore, not because the joy wasn't real, but because I had spent so long since the divorce believing that entire chapter of my life had been a kind of extended mistake, rather than simply a chapter flawed, incomplete, but not without its own real happiness. I used to think, I said slowly, holding a photograph of myself at 34, that once I understood everything your father had hidden, everything he'd taken, all those years would somehow retroactively become fake. As if discovering the ending changed the truth of everything that came before it. But looking at this, I held up the photograph. I don't think that's right anymore. I was happy in this photograph, Trey, genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy. The fact that your father turned out to be capable of things I never imagined doesn't erase that this happiness was real when I lived it. It just means the whole story was longer and more complicated than I understood while I was inside of it. Trey was quiet for a moment, looking at the photographs spread across the table, an entire visual history of a marriage that had produced him, that had shaped his childhood, that had ultimately ended in a betrayal neither of us had fully understood the scope of until recently. I think that's the healthiest thing I've heard anyone say about any of this, he said finally. Not that it was all bad, not that it was all good. Just that it was real, and complicated, and it's allowed to have been both. I gathered the photographs carefully afterward, choosing a handful to frame for my own hallway, not as a shrine to the marriage, but as an honest acknowledgement that the woman in those photographs, and the woman sitting at this kitchen table, 18 months into rebuilding an entire life, were the same person, connected by an unbroken thread of genuine effort and genuine hope, regardless of how the story had eventually turned. It was 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in early March, that Marcus asked me to marry him, not with elaborate ceremony, but quietly, in my own showroom, surrounded by the fabric and the finished projects, and the entire visible evidence of the life I had built with my own 2 hands in the years since Terence Calloway had told me, over a pot roast, that he no longer felt like himself in our marriage. I don't need you to say yes today, Marcus said, holding a small velvet box he'd clearly been carrying around for longer than he'd let on. I know what you rebuilt after everything, and I know how hard you fought to make sure it belonged entirely to you. I'm not asking you to hand any of that over to me. I'm asking if there's room in it for one more person, on your terms, whenever you're ready to answer. I looked around my showroom at the fabric swatches, at the framed photograph of myself at 34 that I'd hung near my desk that same week, at the small drawings I had left taped to the register the previous Wednesday, at the entire architecture of a life I had built without anyone's permission but my own, and I understood that Marcus was asking exactly the right question, in exactly the right way, from a man who had learned, in his own separate grief, the same lesson I had learned in mine, that love, when it's real, makes room for a person's whole rebuilt self, rather than asking them to shrink back down to fit inside an old shape. Yes, I said, and meant it entirely, on my own terms, in my own room, surrounded by everything I had built to prove to myself that I had never, not for one single day since that backyard, been the one who couldn't keep anything that truly mattered. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came a season of small, accumulating closures, the kind that don't announce themselves as endings while they're happening, but that you recognize, looking back, as the moment a story finally settled into its true shape. Danielle's wedding took place in April, in a modest garden venue an hour outside the city, and I sat in the 3rd row beside Marcus, watching a woman I had once been introduced beside as a punchline, marry a kind, unremarkable elementary school teacher, who looked at her the way people look at something they still can't quite believe they are allowed to keep. Danielle found me afterward, during the reception, her veil pushed back, champagne in hand, and hugged me with a warmth that had nothing performed left in it at all. I keep thinking about that day at Zoe's party, she said. I was so afraid, back then, of becoming you, the woman whose marriage didn't work, the cautionary tale everyone whispers about at family gatherings. I said that awful thing about you because some ugly part of me thought if I made you smaller, it would make me safer. I understand now that safety was never something I could get by diminishing another woman. It only ever comes from choosing better, the way I finally did with David. You've grown a great deal this year, I said, and meant it. I'm proud of you, if that means anything coming from someone who was, briefly, the punchline in your origin story. She laughed, a real laugh, and it struck me how far both of us had traveled from that backyard. I proposed to Marguerite, only half joking, that she designed the paperwork for her own career transition as carefully as she'd once helped structure LLCs. And she sent me a photograph a few weeks later of her new office at the law firm, a small brass nameplate reading M. Beaumont, paralegal, with a caption that read simply, started over. Feels good. I understood that feeling now better than almost anyone. It was Terence who surprised me most, that spring. He called in early May, not through Trey this time, but directly, his voice carrying a careful humility that had become, over the past year, genuinely his rather than performed. I wanted you to hear this from me before Trey mentions it, he said. I've started seeing someone. A widow, a bit older than me, quiet, unremarkable in all the best ways, nothing like Danielle. I think I finally understood, somewhere in the last year, that I spent decades chasing versions of excitement that were really just avoidance of the steady, unglamorous work real partnership requires. I'm trying to do it differently this time. I wanted you to know, not for permission, but because I thought you deserved to see that some of what happened between us actually Changed something in me, eventually, even if it took losing everything else first. I hope it's real for you, Terence, I said, and found that I could say it without any bitterness left clinging to the words. Genuinely. Our wedding, mine and Marcus's, took place in June, small and unhurried, in the backyard of the house I had rebuilt my entire life around, the same yard where I had once wondered, in the raw early months after the divorce, whether anyone would ever again choose me on purpose rather than simply remaining because leaving felt too complicated. Trey walked me down a short aisle of folding chairs, Brianna beside him holding Z's hand, and Z, 7 years old now, served as flower girl with the same grave seriousness she'd once brought to questions about grandfathers and mysterious ladies at birthday parties. Terence attended, seated near the back, alone, having asked permission first through Trey, understanding correctly that this was not his day to occupy any prominent space in. He hugged me briefly afterward, careful and respectful, and said only, "You look happy, Regina, genuinely happy. I'm glad, even though I know I have no real claim to any credit for it." "None at all," I agreed, smiling, and we both laughed, the particular easy laugh of two people who had finally, fully, made their peace with an ending neither of them had chosen, but both of them, eventually, had learned to live honestly inside of. Ze found me during the reception, tugging at my dress with the particular urgency 7-year-olds reserve for observations they consider vitally important. "Grandma, everyone keeps saying speeches about you being so strong. What does that mean, exactly?" "Like, strong how?" I crouched down to her level, the fabric of my dress pooling around us both. "You remember that day at your 5th birthday party, when a lady said something unkind about me?" Zoe nodded solemnly. "The couldn't keep him a lady. That's the one. Well, strong doesn't mean I didn't feel hurt. When she said that. I did feel hurt. Strong just meant I didn't let her unkind sentence decide what the rest of my story was going to be. I went and built this whole beautiful life instead. The store, Marcus, still getting to see you every single Wednesday. That's what strong actually looks like. Sweetheart. It's not about not getting hurt. It's about deciding, after you get hurt, what you're going to build next." Z considered this with her characteristic gravity, then grinned, the gap where she'd recently lost a tooth showing plainly. "I'm gonna be strong like you when I'm big too." "I have absolutely no doubt about that," I said, and pulled my granddaughter into a hug in the middle of my own wedding reception, surrounded by every person who had, in some form, walked with me through the long, complicated year it had taken to arrive at this particular garden, this particular June evening, this particular unshakable peace. A year to the day after Danielle introduced me to a stranger as the one who couldn't keep him, I found myself back in the same backyard where it had happened. Trey and Brianna's yard, decorated once again with balloons for Zoe's 6th birthday, the same bounce house folded into a slightly different corner, the same lemonade station Terence had once manned like a man performing domesticity for an audience of one. I stood in the doorway for a moment before walking in, the way I had a year earlier, and I noticed, with a small private smile, how different the sensation felt in my body now. A year ago, that doorway had marked the beginning of the worst humiliation of my adult life. Now it simply marked the entrance to a party for a granddaughter I adored, in a family I had spent 12 months rebuilding into something sturdier and more honest than it had ever been before. Marcus's hand found mine as we walked in together. And across the yard, I caught Terence's eye, seated this time not beside a wife performing careless cruelty, but alone at a picnic table, quiet, present, diminished in the ways that had turned out to matter and unchanged. In the ways that still made him recognizably Z's grandfather. He nodded to me, the same careful, respectful nod he'd offered at my wedding, and I nodded back. And that was the entire transaction between us now, two people who had once built a whole life together, meeting now only at the edges of a family that still, somehow, held both of us with room to spare. Danielle arrived an hour later with David, her new husband's hand resting easily at the small of her back, and she made a point of finding me near the dessert table, hugging me warmly before she'd even said hello to half the other guests. "1 year," she said. "Do you remember what I said to you that day?" "I remember," I said. "I think about it constantly, not with shame anymore. Exactly, I've done the work to forgive myself for who I was that year. But as a kind of marker, you know." of how much can actually change in 12 months, if you're honest enough to let it. I thought about that phrase long after the party had wound down, after the cake had been cut and the presents opened and Zoe had fallen asleep on Trey's shoulder, sticky-handed and radiant, exhausted from an entire day of being the center of a family's love. How much can actually change in 12 months, if you're honest enough to let it. I thought about the woman who had sat in a folding chair a year earlier, sipping lemonade she hadn't asked for, absorbing a stranger's careless cruelty with a smile she'd spent decades perfecting, believing, somewhere beneath the practice calm, that dignity meant silence, that grace meant not looking too closely at what she might have been owed. That woman had not disappeared over the past year. She had simply grown into someone who understood, finally, that the two things she'd once believed were opposites, grace and vigilance, silence and strength, had never actually been in conflict at all. She had simply needed a single careless sentence, delivered in a backyard she loved, to teach her the difference between the peace that comes from avoidance and the peace that comes from finally, fully, standing in the truth of her own worth. I do not know, sitting here now, exactly what the next year will hold for Marcus and me, for Trey's growing family, for Danielle's new marriage, for whatever quieter, more honest version of himself Terence continues building in the wreckage of the life he once took for granted. I have learned enough, this past year, to know that I don't need to know the whole shape of the future in order to trust that I'll meet whatever arrives in it with the same steady clarity that carried me through the worst of what came before. What I do know is this: I am no longer the woman who couldn't keep him. I never actually was. I was, all along, simply a woman who had not yet finished discovering everything she was capable of keeping: a business, a family's honest respect, a granddaughter's uncomplicated love, and finally, a version of peace built entirely on her own terms, requiring no one's permission but her own to exist. If you've made it this far with me, I hope you'll carry one thing forward from this story, whatever chapter of your own life you're standing in tonight. The people who try to make you smaller are usually revealing more about their own fear than anything true about your worth. Let them talk, build anyway. And trust that the quietest, most patient kind of strength, the kind that watches and waits and finally acts with full clarity, will always outlast the loudest cruelty aimed at you in a single careless sentence. Thank you for walking this whole road with me. Thank you for being one of the reasons we keep creating. Don't forget to like and subscribe.